Hey, how you getting on? Today on the Hair Gel Review channel... Did I get scammed? This doesn't work. We do some gear test engineering and myth busting. A while ago I made a poll on my channel asking you guys what kind of video you'd like to see more of, and gear test engineering / myth busting got the most votes by far. And I'm not mad at that at all. In fact, I'm stoked. And to celebrate the occasion, I got the lab coat out from the Big Vintage 30 test from a few years ago. So yeah, let's test. The test today is about blending speakers, specifically if when we blend speakers, one speaker actually affects the frequency response of the other speaker. That might sound a bit odd at first, but let me explain. I've made quite a few videos on the Fein F70, a standalone speaker video, a Fein F70 versus the Fryette P50E, because I thought the F70 was the same as the F70G, which is the other OEM speaker Fryette put in their cabs. But then later I made another F70G versus F70 video because I was wrong. And on one of these videos I got a comment that made me think. I don't remember which video exactly the comment was under, from who it was or what the exact wording was, but the gist of it was, if you want to hear the F70 in its full glory, you need to put it in a cab with only other F70s. You see, if you're new to this channel, the way I demo speakers is, I put the speaker I'm demoing in a Marshall 412 together with 3 vintage 30s, and I mic up the speaker I'm testing and one of the vintage 30s, each with an SM57, and then I switch back and forth between the mics in editing. So if that statement is true, I might be in a bit of trouble. At first I scoffed at it, I admit, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought there might be something to it. See, we tend to rate speakers at either 4, 8, or 16 ohms. Those are the most common ratings for speakers we have at the moment, but those aren't resistances. We don't put DC on the speakers, we drive them with AC. And the impedance of the speaker is dependent on the frequency, and most speakers will be like this. At low frequencies, they're usually close to their nominal values. So 8 ohm speakers will usually have around 6.8 to 7 ohms there, and they'll, stay at that range. And then between 50 and 100 hertz, the impedance will spike up drastically. It'll fall back down then close to the nominal value, and then it will start rising again with increasing frequency. And this is different for each speaker, or slightly different. Most speaker manufacturers have the impedance curve on the data sheets on their website. And shout out to Jensen Speakers for this, because their website is fantastic. It's full of data, and their impedance and frequency response graphs actually have a cursor on them so you can see the exact value per frequency, and that's pretty cool. Now at this point you might be thinking, what the shit does this have to do with anything? But bear with me. Part of the magic of tube amps and why we love them so much is their output transformer, and the output transformer of the amplifier interacts with the load it's connected to. So the speakers, typically the load that is connected to the amplifier, and the output transformer, they kind of dance with each other, they interact. There's a push and a pull. And the amp reacts differently depending on how it is loaded. That is why different load boxes sound different from each other. And that's why impedance mismatches, say we connect the 8 ohm out of our amplifier to a 4 ohm cab or a 16 ohm cab, will affect the frequency response. Now, what would happen if we mix speakers in one cabinet that have different impedance curves to each other? Say we have a 4x12 cabinet that is loaded with Fein F70s. And now we take 2 of those F70s out and put 2 pretty different speakers in there, speakers that have a different impedance curve. The overall impedance curve we end up with is kind of an average of the individual speakers' impedance curves. So we get a different overall impedance curve than with the purely F70 loaded cabinet. That would mean, at least in my mind, that the amplifier or the output transformer of the amplifier would react slightly or interact slightly differently with the load and drive the speakers differently. So the F70 might be driven differently in the all F70 loaded cab than in the half F70 loaded cab. Now, is this interaction between the output transformer and the load large enough to actually change the frequency response to the speakers? I'm not really sure. In my mind it could, might not. If it does, I'm in trouble, because that means I'll have to change my entire speaker demo setup. I'll have to use 2 1x12s, for example, and switch back and forth between those. Anyway, let's find out. This is my Zilla Fatboy 212. It's a front-loaded, oversized 2x12 cab. And since the F70 was the speaker that pushed me down this rabbit hole in the first place, I figured it's only adequate to load it with the F70s. And I don't know, the guy might have been onto something, because I think it sounds pretty dope. So here's the test. What I did was I mic'd up this F70 with my Shure SM57 Unidyne 3 because I was feeling fancy that day. This is my fanciest of SM57 mics. And then I reamped the riff and I did a Room EQ Wizard sweep. Then I changed out this speaker for a Fein M30. This is a neodymium speaker. Repeated the procedure. Then I repeated it with a Jensen 10-inch Blackbird 40, which is an Alnico speaker. Not only is it an Alnico speaker, it's a 10-inch speaker. I was able to mount this in the cab with this cool adapter ring from Tube Amp Doctor. And then finally, I repeated that test again with a Celestion Vintage 30, because I think that's probably going to be the most popular blend. I thought that'd be a good mix of different kind of speaker types, especially the Jensen Blackbird. I don't think you're going to be hard pressed to find a speaker that's more different than that, at least in, the common ones we got here. This was only supposed to be the first test though. The idea was if I didn't get any difference in frequency response between those different pairings here, then the test would be over. Obviously, blending speakers wouldn't affect the other. But if there was a difference, then the job would be to determine where does that difference come from. Does the different blend actually change the frequency response of this speaker? Or is the SM57 just picking up, sound from the other speaker? To do that, the idea was to take the most different sounding pairing and repeat that in a different setup by putting the F70 in this Gossmann SG ISO cab right here and putting the other speaker in a different cab. So having the speakers completely isolated physically and just connected electrically, and then repeat the test. I can already tell you there were differences with this setup, and I had to do the ISO cab test, but things got weird there. We'll get to that in a minute. Before the main test, there was one pre-test I had to do to isolate one variable, and that is the wiring of the speakers. See, I'm using 8 ohm speakers in this test, and in a 2x12 you can wire those up in two ways. You can wire them in series to get an overall impedance of 16 ohms, or you can wire them in parallel to get an overall impedance of 4 ohms. Now the question is, would the way the speakers are wired together affect the effect of the blend? And to do that, I wired up each pair in series and in parallel, did reamps and Room EQ Wizard sweeps, and I can tell you the frequency response between those different pairings didn't really change. When the speakers were wired in parallel, they were the tiniest bit less efficient, but I can only see that in the Room EQ Wizard graphs. I wasn't able to hear that when A/Bing the tracks. So I don't think wiring them in series or in parallel has any effect on the effect. Anyway, enough of me yapping. Here are the sound samples of the reamped sounds with all the blends, and I'll meet you at my desk afterwards, and then we'll look at some graphs, and I'll get into details about the weird findings I found later on in the test. So yeah, not exactly earth-shattering differences, are there? There might be the tiniest bit of difference. I'm not too sure if it's volume differences or not, because for once I didn't normalize the tracks here. I thought that would be cheating. I think the volume differences belong to this test as well. There might have been more difference with the Blackbird 40 and 10 inch. Personally, I didn't hear much of a difference with the V30 or the M30. But yeah, let's look at some graphs. But before we do that, I want to, validate my methodology to you guys, starting with the series versus parallel wiring test. I'm just going to show you a few graphs here. These are the two F70 tests. Blue is F70 and F70 wired in parallel, while that orange color is wired in series. And pretty much everything above, say, 70 hertz, I disregard anything below 80 hertz, to be honest. It's pretty much bang on the same frequency response. Some tiny differences between 5 and 600 hertz here. I think the parallel test or the parallel wiring might be the tiniest fraction of a dB less efficient. And it pretty much looked much the same with the other speaker pairings as well. Here's F70 and V30 in parallel versus F70 and V30 in series. You see here, I disregard that. That's stuff we'd cut out anyway. And it's much the same. The parallel wiring seems to be, at least in some frequencies, the tiniest bit less efficient. And we'll look at the F70 and the Blackbird 40 as well. Where's that? Red is in series and blue is in parallel. Oh, it's actually the opposite there. But yeah, pretty much similar frequency response. And to validate my methodology, I did one sweep with the two F70s at the start. I only did the series wiring there. This is at the beginning of the test, F70 and F70. Then after I'd changed out all the speakers, I put back the F70 and did another sweep just to validate that I didn't move the mic a bit. And you can see those are pretty bang on. Now, let's take a look at, I'm just going to use the parallel ones for that, F70 and F70 compared to F70 and V30. And we can see some slight differences there, but nothing earth-shattering, nothing worth calling home about. F70 and N30 looks like this in comparison, and we see some slightly different behavior between 5 and 600 hertz there. That is 106 dB. That is 98.6 dB. So there's a 2 dB difference here. But apart from that, nothing really stands out, except maybe here at 3.4 kilohertz. Nothing spectacular. Let's compare that though to the pairing F70 and Blackbird 40 in 10 inch. And we can see that is a lot more quiet. And I think we were able to hear that in the sound samples just a minute ago. You can see there's definitely less output here. But in terms of frequency response, there isn't, well, maybe here between 1 and 2K, there's a few peaks and valleys that are shifted a bit. So there is a bit of a difference there. Now the question really is, where do these differences come from? Does this speaker pairing actually change the frequency response of the F70? Or is it just that we're getting some bleed from the other speaker into the mic? Because the SM57 is a cardioid microphone. I mean, that's pretty directional, but it's not perfectly directional. So sounds that are coming from the side might factor into this, as we have it with speakers wired up next to each other. And to find out if that's the case, as I mentioned earlier on, I put the F70 in an ISO cab and wired the other speakers in parallel to that. That's also why I showed you the parallel graphs here instead of the series graphs, because, yeah, just to keep it consistent. And I'm going to play you sound samples with the ISO cab now. interestingly enough, the differences between those sound files seem larger to me than they were in the other test where the speakers were in the same cabinet. These speakers are physically completely isolated to each other. They're only connected electrically through the amplifier. But let's look at some graphs first. What you're seeing here is the F70 in the ISO cab. That's the one that is mic'd up. And I just left the other F70 in the 2x12 cab and just wired that up by itself. So there was an empty space in that cabinet. And that's something important we need to keep in mind. So this is the F70 in the ISO cab connected to an F70 wired up all by itself in a 2x12 with a big hole in that. Now, I did the same thing with the Blackbird 40 in there. And you can see there's a big difference, you know, between, around 110 and 120 hertz. There's a big difference here. This is 103 dB versus 94 dB. So that's 9 dB's difference. That would explain why they sounded so different. That volume difference alone is going to factor into the equation. However, I'd like to point out one thing. The frequency response above that, you know, after this blip here at 260 hertz, is pretty much identical. The Blackbird 40 pairing just is less efficient, but I can't see any differences in the peaks and valleys. The offset between them seems to be consistent, and I find that odd. Why is everything above 260 hertz pretty much identical apart from maybe some volume difference, but the low end is far more different when the speakers are actually completely isolated from each other physically? And the reason for that is a methodological error on my part, because I got a little lazy. As I said, I had the F70 wired up still in the 2x12 cab. For the Blackbird 40 here, I just wired it up outside of the cab. I just disconnected the cables from the F70 and wired up the Blackbird 40 outside of the cab. And remember that, because that's going to be important. I got lazy there, but I'm glad I did, because I discovered something very interesting, at least, you know, when it comes to nerd shit. Anyway, back to the graphs. This kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I was confused about that. So the next day, I repeated that test with the Vintage 30 instead of the Blackbird 40. I did the F70 and F70 again as a reference, because unfortunately I'd taken the speaker out of the ISO cab after the test. I put it back in and had to redo the sweep, even though you'll see here they're pretty much identical, apart from the weirdness here between 30 and 90 hertz, but I disregard that. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. And then I did the same thing with the V30. And again, we see the frequency response above 260 hertz, pretty much identical. But we see a difference here between, you know, around 100 and 120 hertz. So I think that's the resonance frequency of the cabinet. And then it clicked, because I had wired up the Vintage 30 outside of the cab like the Blackbird 40 in the test the day before. And I figured that might have something to do with it. So I just popped the Vintage 30 into the free space in the 2x12. So both speakers, an F70 and a Vintage 30, were in the 2x12 cab, but only the Vintage 30 was connected electrically. And we can see, again, the frequency response above 260 hertz is pretty much identical, but this low end bump shifts again. After that, I took the F70 out of the cab and put the Vintage 30 in where the F70 was before previously, leaving the other space free, so creating the exact same physical conditions that I had for the F70 and F70 reference measurement here, and did the sweep again. And look at that. The graphs in purple and blue are almost identical now, down to this blip at 260 hertz. That was pretty fascinating to me. And I repeated the test again the next day just to make sure that we didn't have any weird hiccup. At this point, I didn't do any sound samples anymore because I couldn't be bothered. To be honest, every test I've done so far using Room EQ Wizard has proven that Room EQ Wizard and the sound samples are pretty consistent. They pretty much show the same thing, but I only did a few reamps just to have sounds in this video. It'd be kind of silly to make a video on, you know, tonal differences without featuring any tones. But for all intents and purposes, Room EQ Wizard is absolutely enough. Now, just to make sure this wasn't some metrological hiccup, I repeated the test for a third time just to get some more data. So once again, we're seeing here
an F70 in the ISO cab connected in parallel to another F70 in my 2x12 cab with the second speaker cutout left empty. So effectively making it a ported 1x12 with a huge port. I then disconnected the F70 in the 2x12 cab and connected a vintage 30 pointing upward, and we can see everything above 260 hertz is pretty much identical, apart from maybe a fraction of a dB here at 550 hertz. But we see there's a big shift in that resonance frequency between 100 and 120 hertz. I then flipped the vintage 30 over, having it point downward. And we can see again, pretty much everything over 260 hertz is almost identical, but this resonance changes. And just to make sure that this is consistent, I turned the vintage 30 around once again, having it point upward again, and repeated the sweep. And you can't even see me putting that in. I'll have to fade out the other one here. You can see orange line. I get the exact same result for the same direction again. So that's consistent. I then put the vintage 30 back in the cabinet. So 2 speakers were in there, and we can see pretty much the same, apart from a shift in these what appear to be resonance frequencies. This shifts downward from 260 to about 243, 245, and this peak shifts down from 116 to maybe 105. So we have about a 10 hertz shift. Then to make it final, I took out the F70, put the vintage 30 in where the F70 was, and we can see pretty much, apart from the tiniest shift here, the exact same frequency response that we had before. And to me, this is the most interesting finding, because these results kind of imply that the type of speaker doesn't seem to affect the frequency response of the other speaker in any meaningful way once we isolate them electrically and have the mounting situation or the environmental conditions the same. The frequency response doesn't change. I mean, if this is the difference between an F70 and a vintage 30 as the second speaker, and it's the difference is pretty much non-existent. I wouldn't consider this a difference at all, even if we have maybe a tiny shift in this resonance frequency, which I believe is the resonance frequency of the cabinet. What does affect the mic speaker, however, seems to be the environmental conditions in which the other speaker is mounted. So basically, the enclosure and the overall resonance of the system. We can see that if the speaker is out in free air, it has a different resonance than it has in the cab. And I can't explain this any other way. It seems to be that these physical conditions do something with the speaker electrically in a way that is so severe that it affects a speaker that is isolated from that physically, entirely. So whatever is happening here, it seems to be that the impedance of the speaker changes depending on its mounting conditions. So depending on the volume of the enclosure it's in. I find this fascinating. I didn't expect that at all. And I wouldn't have noticed that if I hadn't made this mistake. I definitely have to look into this some more. I need to find out a way how I can actually measure the impedance of a speaker to see if the mounting conditions of the speaker actually affect its impedance curve. Yeah, I'm kind of stumbling over my words here. I'm not really sure. I'm not happy with the way I'm explaining this because I know I don't know enough about this, but I have a consistent characteristic I can observe here. And I think that's really cool. Whatever this, and it definitely warrants some further testing. With regards to my speaker testing, I'm confident to conclude that the way I demo speakers is fine. I don't see any data here that would indicate that I really need to change that procedure. I have a bit of bleed from the other speaker into the respective mics, but that doesn't seem to, or I don't think that affects the overall result in a in a way so meaningful that it would warrant me shifting to a different approach, like using two 1x12 cabs and switching back and forth between those. Although I might want to try that just for shits and giggles. You guys can tell me in the comments below if you'd like me to do that. I still have an Engel 1x12 here, which sounds fantastic. Really, I'm supposed to send that back, but I might beg for them to sell it to me, and maybe I could get a second one and do speaker tests that way, switch back and forth between those. But that would just be because it would be an interesting alternative. It's not something I think that needs to be done based on these results. So yeah, if the mounting conditions of the speakers are the same, it appears that they do not affect each other's sound in a meaningful way, at least. So yes, definitely an interesting result, at least to me. I hope for you guys as well. I didn't expect that. And I definitely want to do some more research into the way the enclosure actually affects the speaker, not just its frequency response, but also its electrical characteristics. So I should definitely take a note of that.